I would like to start formally by thanking you for coming and joining with us on this webinar. So we have 5 attendees at the moment with us. Some more will be joining us soon. And we have Professor Geeta Gandhi Kingdon and Professor A.K. Shiva Kumar with us, who will be sharing their experiences and their findings, their research, and their ideas about the DBT, direct benefit transfers in education in India. So my name is Nitesh Anand, and I work with Center for Civil Society. And we are the host for today's webinar on this theme. So this webinar is actually part of our School Choice series of webinars that we are doing. Since this is the time of the year when we actually run the School Choice campaign, which is starting today with this webinar and will go on for on this Sunday when we will be having our School Choice National Conference, followed by more closed group discussions, which will then we will be taking it forward to more series of webinars and conversations and engagements on different forums. So starting the webinar now formally, I would like to request Professor Kingdon to talk about her idea of DBT in education in India and presenting the landscape, the education landscape that she thinks about. Yeah, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, it's very good to join a conversation on this topic, this really important topic, because the situation of education in the country, school education in the country, is very parlous. And I congratulate the CCS for organizing the conference that's coming up in Delhi. I was asked to first lay out the landscape of education in school education in the country, and then to talk a little bit about the challenges and how DBT, direct benefit transfer, could offer a solution. I will take you through quickly through some of these slides. I have chosen them I've been very selective in which ones I'm showing. I mean, otherwise I had about 10 times as many slides. So first of all, let me just launch while they're loading up. I think most of the people who have joined this webinar would already be aware that student outcomes in our country are very pitiably low. And when outcomes are that bad, we have to question what is going on that is causing them to be so disappointing. One of the slides I'm trying to show here, I don't know whether everybody can see it or if it's too small, but this table that's in front of you at the moment shows the picture for the period between 2010-11 and 2016-17. In this 6-year period, it shows the total number of government schools, the total stock of government schools increased by just over 8,000 schools, from about 10,35,000 to about 10,43,000 schools. So the total stock of government schools increased by a very minuscule number, namely 8,300 or so new government schools came into being, or extra government schools came into being. In the meanwhile, over the same period, the number of private schools that increased in the country by 96,400 or so. So it's an extremely rapid growth of private schooling and a lack of growth of government schooling. If we could go on to the next slide, please. I hope you can see that in the very last row, the All India row at the bottom, it showed that the total stock of government schooling is increased by about 8,000 schools. The total stock of private schooling has increased by about 96,000 schools. So while we wait for the next slide to come up, yeah, here it is. This is showing the change in enrollment in government schools, and also for good measure, we show it for private schools. So again, if we just focus on the last row of the table, showing the situation for the 20 major states of India, and when I say 20, Telangana is included in Andhra Pradesh at the top. So if you count them as 2 different states, then it's the total for 21 major states of India. So then the total number of students, the student enrollment between 2010 and 2016, the 6-year period, in the government school sector, the total enrollment has fallen by 1.83 crores. 1.8 crore reduction in the total number of children studying in government schools. We're talking about elementary schooling only. And by contrast, in private schools, the increase is 1.7 crore enrollments over this short 6-year period. So again, a picture is confirmed of a kind of a exodus from the government schooling sector, kind of emptying of government schools and a filling up of private schools, a demand for private school places. Let's go on to the next slide, please. So there is a kind of an abandonment of government schools. Now, this table is showing the number of small schools and the number of tiny schools in the within the government schooling sector, how their numbers have changed over time. And although it's not, the slide is a little small, let me just take you through, just pointing out two small things in it. If you look at the row which is highlighted in pink, which says 50 or less, that means the total enrollment of 50 or fewer students. That is showing that there were 313,169 government schools that were so small as to have 50 or fewer students. And if you pan across a little bit further, average pupils per school in these 313,000 schools is 30.4 students per school. In the school as a whole, there's 30 children on an average for these 313,000 government schools. And that as a proportion of 10,35,000 schools is about 30%. So in the year 2010-11, 30% of all government schools had an average enrollment of 30 students per school. That means if it's class 1 to 5, it means 6 students per class. Or if it's 1 to 8, then obviously it's less than 4 students per, or just around 4 students per class. And what has happened in the 6-year period, 6 years later, that number has swelled to 4,17,193. That means by 1 lakh or so, the number of such tiny government schools has increased by more than 1 lakh, by roughly 1 lakh, 1,04,000. And the proportion of government schools that were so small has increased from 30% to roughly 40% now in just a short 6-year period. So all of this is just showing just this one phenomenon. When we look at government schooling achievement levels, we find that they are lower than those in private schools, learning outcomes. And of course, it could be because private school children come from better off homes. They come from more privileged and more educated homes. So we cannot attribute all of the raw achievement gap between private schools and government schools to the fact that the schools are necessarily better quality. But then when more sophisticated studies have been done that control for student home background, it is found typically that although the raw achievement advantage of private schools falls considerably when you control for home background, it does not disappear. There's still a residual, sometimes substantial, sometimes small achievement advantage left over. Right. And this situation, by the way, is not confined to elementary schooling, as one can imagine. Elementary schooling is the base of the education system. By the time it comes to the secondary schooling level, we find that there are major problems. For example, the exam pass rate in the high school board examinations in the state of Uttar Pradesh, when in 1 year police were installed in all the examination centers of the UP High School Examinations Board, the pass rate fell to 14.9%. Less than 15% of children could get the pass mark or more. The pass mark is only very low, 33% marks you need in the aggregate in order to pass. So less than 15% of the children who took the high school exam could pass it. So the situation is pretty problematic in both elementary and secondary education. Question then is, so this is just a layout of what the challenges are, some of them as we can see them. Now, there are a range of diagnoses as to what the reasons are for these poor outcomes for the emptying of government schools. Among these potential explanations, the three that seem to figure most prominently are things such as that government schools don't run well because they don't have enough teachers. That turns out to be a very it's not actually a correct assertion, because when you look at the DICE data, the District Information System on Education, that data is actually school returns data. The government schools themselves fill that data, and any private schools that are sent that also fill the questionnaire themselves. So when we look at those, it shows that and we know that anecdotally that if anything, government schools have an incentive to over-report their enrollments, because the more the enrollments that are shown, the higher the level of allocation of grains for midday meals, of cloth for uniform, and so on and so forth. So despite the presence of those incentives, the truth is that the government schools themselves are showing an enrollment that when you divide that by the number of teachers, again, given by the schools themselves, the pupil-teacher ratio in elementary education is seen as being 24 to 26 in most of the states of India, an average of about 25 students per teacher. So it is a question, if it is a question at all, it's a question of deployment of teachers. They seem to be concentrated in certain urban areas and not so much in rural areas. And that is why, but even so, the allocation is not so highly skewed as it is sometimes made out. So I think that the potential explanation that it is to do with, a shortage of teachers does not hold water as per the available data. Sometimes it is thought that it is due to a lack of infrastructure. Indeed, the Right to Education Act mandates that all schools shall acquire the relevant infrastructure that is mandated in the schedule of the Right to Education Act. All schools shall acquire such infrastructure within 3 years from the time of the commencement of the Act, the implementation of the Act in April 2010. Now, it turns out that in a parliamentary question that was asked as to what proportion of government schools themselves fulfill that fulfill all the infrastructure norms of the RTE Act, the answer that came in Parliament was 6.4% of government schools fulfill that. So even if it were the case that good quality comes from infrastructure, it would be available only in 6.4% of the government schools. But internationally, and the small amount of research that exists for India, we know from the vast literature internationally that it is not the amount of infrastructure that a school has got or the adequacy or availability of infrastructure as certain other things, because there's a lot of research on, for example, the impact of class size on student achievements. It's often, the Right to Education Act has this extremely expensive prescription that the pupil-teacher ratio should be reduced to a maximum of 30 pupils per teacher. Now, we know from DICE data that already the pupil-teacher ratio is significantly lower than that, of the order of 25 students per teacher. So there's no issue there. But there is no support for the notion that reducing class size improves students' learning outcomes. If you look at the sum totality of the literature that's available, economists like Eric Hanushek have summarized, for example, in one of his papers in the journal called Economic Journal in 2003, he did a meta-analysis, and the title of his paper was The Failure of Inputs-Based Policies in Education. So this inputs-based approach of the Right to Education Act has also not worked, because we know that 6 years after the implementation of the Act, the learning achievement levels of children have actually fallen rather than risen. And this is not just shown by the USSR report, but also by the NCERT's own National Achievement Survey of 2011 and 2015. When you look at 4 years apart, in every single curricular area, the learning achievement levels of children fell. So the kinds of conventional explanations that have been forwarded as to why it is that schooling in government schools is inadequate, why are people leaving government schools, the kinds of explanations that have been suggested have not held water. They don't stand up to scrutiny. So the question is, what really is the problem? And obviously, different people's diagnoses could differ. And I'm sure that A.K. Shiva Kumar, who's also joined this panel, will have his own views as well. And all of you will have your own ideas as to what it is. But one thing that seems relevant is to share with you this data on teacher absence rates. Teacher presence rates could be regarded as a measure of the effort level that teachers are putting in, the effort level that schools are putting in. We don't have very recent data on teacher absence. When the World Bank did a survey in about 2005, and it showed that teacher absence rate in India was one of the highest. It did it in 9 countries, and India's was the second highest, just after Uganda. The Ministry of Human Resource Development could hardly believe that 25% of teachers were absent on any given day. And so the MHRD did its own survey, and it found that the figure was roughly the same in its own survey. So we don't have very much data that's very recent, but subsequently, Karthik Muralidharan has done a study with data from the year 2010. And this study shows that overall teacher absence rate fell very marginally from 25% to about 23.6%, so 1.4% reduction. But in certain states, it rose. For example, in Uttar Pradesh, it rose from 26% to 31.2%. That means roughly 1 out of every 3 days a teacher is absent. So an absence rate of roughly a quarter, that means one day out of every 4 days a teacher is absent. That is indeed a very chronically high absentee rate. And what it suggests is that the problem, therefore, is not, see, government school teachers are educated, they are trained, they do not they have to be mandatorily trained, and most of them are trained. Not everybody, but almost all of them are trained, and the para teachers also are increasingly being trained. So the point is that the government school teachers are more educated, they are more trained, despite, and of course they are extremely better paid, and I will show you in a minute what the teacher pay levels are like. So what is the problem? If you are better trained, you're better educated, you're better paid, much better paid. So what then can be the problem? Why is the absence rate of teachers in government schools so much higher than the absence rates of teachers, for example, in private schools? In the say in Muralidharan's survey, he also did a estimate of private school teacher absentee. So I think that one of the major problems in the country is the lack of accountability of teachers that are in the government schools. And when you contrast that with the private sector, you find that teacher accountability must be, the structures must be better. Indeed, A.K. Shiv Kumar was part of the probe report in 1999, and then probe 2 that has also been done more recently. And both of these have shown that really the nub of the problem is the poor chain of accountability in the government schooling system. If we agree with this diagnosis, and in fact, most people do not talk about this, most people do not talk about accountability, most people do not talk about teacher politicization, the fact that the Indian Constitution gives guaranteed representation to teachers in the upper houses of the state legislature. Most people do not talk about teacher unionization and the impact of that militant, strong unionization on the extent to which teachers who are themselves in the corridors of power as teacher MLCs and as teacher MLAs, because they are not debarred from contesting in elections, because aided school teachers are not deemed to hold an office of profit under the government, despite the fact that they are government paid servants. They are not debarred from contesting elections to the lower house as well. The fact that our lower houses, the fact that our upper houses of legislatures are they have got a high proportion of membership are teachers. The fact that teachers are present in the corridors of power, what does that mean for the kinds of rules and regulations they shall pass? This teacher accountability, this political economy of education in the country has received scant policy attention, and it needs to. And if we agree that teacher politicization, teacher accountability are the main problems why the government schooling sector is performing poorly, then we shall have to look at ways of improving accountability structures. That is where a DBT comes in. A direct benefit transfer is a school voucher is one form of direct benefit transfer. That means at the moment the funding to government schools is in the nature of a block grant. That means the government gives a lump sum to a school, and which is almost entirely equal to 100% equal to the teacher salary bill of that school. The government gives a grant to each government school and aided school, which is equal almost exactly to the salaries of the teachers that are appointed in that school. And this is a block grant, although it is meant to be conditional on the number of pupils that are in the school. De facto, no teacher is ever removed. Hardly ever you will find a case that a teacher has been removed, even though the number of students may have fallen year on year on year, and it may have reduced to a very low level. So there is no accountability structure built into the grant formula. Indeed, there is no grant formula. The grant formula is equal to the total wage bill of the school teachers. In other countries, government grant to government funded schools is a per student grant. In other words, if the school loses children, if the children abandon the school and move on to other schools, the school's total revenue will fall. So there's an inherent incentive for uh, uh, teachers to work hard, to give good results, to keep parents happy in order to retain the children. Because if they retain the children, they shall retain the totality of their grant. If they lose children, their grant amount will be constantly diminishing. So, in order to keep their jobs, they have to keep on their toes. Now, we do not have such a student per student grant in India. So that would be a very good move forward if, at the very least, we could have a per student grant. But a DBT, a school voucher, goes further. It really empowers the parent by giving the power into the hand of the parent. A voucher bearing parent is akin to a fee paying parent. The voucher bearing parent can choose among the schools that are in his or her locality. And even in urban areas, the penetration of private schooling is such that in many urban areas, there is a choice of schooling available. And certainly it is the case in the urban and semi-urban areas that there is in every locality, there is an availability. Moreover, where there is not an availability, there is such a disparity in the um, in the expenditure that government incurs um, in or per pupil in the government schooling sector and the fee levels that are charged by the private schooling sector. There's such a gap between that, huge gap between that, that if the government were to give even a relatively modest amount of money as per pupil expenditure, as a per pupil reimbursement to private schools, or the voucher value was set at a even a fraction of the government schools per pupil spending on its own schools, it would be a good enough incentive for private operators to come into the market and for the supply side to boost. In other words, there would be a greater supply of private schools also happening if there was a school voucher available as a means of funding. And the benefit of a school voucher would then be that it sets up a competition between government schools and private schools, among private schools between themselves, and among private schools within themselves, within the private school community and the government school community and across. This competition is the thing that can drive quality and that is likely to provide the spur for better quality education.
Thanks a lot, Geeta, for giving like this great understanding and deeper insight into like the current education landscape in India, and also like bringing from there like how exactly does it feed into a larger goal of learning outcome based system and accountable system, which can be like solved through DBT being one of the mediums. On that note, I would like to invite Professor Shiva Kumar to take over and like present his views. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you. Thanks, Geeta, for an excellent overview and sharing your vision of how to reform the education system in India. I'm going to make 5 or 6 very short observations. Let me start by saying that whether you're talking about vouchers or even some kind of conditional cash transfers, school quality is very important to keep in mind. So if school quality is deficient for a number of reasons, like it may not be the short or poorly educated or less motivated teachers, infrastructure, etc., then of course giving any kind of a cash incentive or school vouchers makes very little sense, because you're really not giving a choice. So there is an assumption here that if you give vouchers to parents and empower them, they have to choose between schools, and it will work only in a situation where you can assure the parents that the quality of schooling, whether in the government sector, admittedly if in government it is bad, that assuredly in the private sector it is much better. Otherwise, it's just a waste of resources, and in fact, it does help in promoting attendance. I suppose the private schools will be more enthusiastic about getting the children into school, but it does not necessarily mean both in the government sector that the government is going to improve all the problems of teachers that you pointed out is going to be addressed, or the poor quality of training of untrained teachers in many of these private shops is going to improve. So the question therefore then arises is there a better money? What is the opportunity cost of really giving these cash vouchers? Would such funds which are scarce be better used for providing better quality training, professional development of teachers, some incentives for teaching, high quality reading material, etc.? The second one is, I think, what it's sort of I'm picking up from what you said, that the low quality of education, of course, in the Indian system, admittedly, might be coming from all kinds of corruption in the system of recruitment, transfers, postings. When you really say it's not a question of a shortage of teachers, it's really the distribution of teachers across schools. What all they do to stay in one particular place, the role of unions, politicians, etc. Then this cash voucher actually has got a very interesting. It's a double political advantage of a very perverse kind, I would say. One is that you avoid all the problems of education reforms, because we really can't do anything with these government schools and government teachers. So let's just abandon the problem, and we won't get into any real political fights with anybody. Like you use these words, exodus, emptying, abandoning of government schools. We'll use that as the basis, slowly get rid of this problem of how to fix the public education system. And in fact, we might get a double bonus here. Because politically it is very attractive that I'm going to give poor people. Why poor people? Give everybody. Make it universal. We'll give universally everybody cash vouchers to go and choose make a school of their choice. I think again this is a cop out by the government, and it's really I feel it's a very politically clever way to avoid difficult education reforms. The third point I want to make is if you really give these cash vouchers or direct benefit transfers, it should not be assessed really in terms of whether they succeed in increasing school attendance among the children. Of course, it will increase the school attendance among children. If you give it in government schools, there is an incentive for the kids to go to government schools, or if you give it in the private, like you say, the private schools will do their best to retain you in school. So the question is really not about choices, but really to ask the more fundamental question: how is it improving the well-being and opportunities for children, both in the short term and in the long term? Now, and here is where I come to the third point, that let us make an assumption that the quality of instruction available to children in the private schools is far superior. It is far superior than what it is in the government schools. Like you say, it is marginally superior, but let's say it is much better. Let's not say let's make that assumption. Then we are making a huge assumption that by giving these vouchers and by ensuring that these children are in school, that more education or more years in school, because kids are dropping out of government schools because there are no teachers coming or there's no motivation to teach. So obviously it's the most rational thing for poor children in government schools to drop out. So that problem we're taking care of by ensuring that children really stay in school. Now, what is the evidence that we have that more years spent in school really is better for the kids? And most economists, as you know, would have done the wage differentials between people who have done 3 years of schooling, 5 years of schooling, 8 years of schooling, and to establish the fact that, yes, more years in school actually contributes to higher earnings, and therefore the spending time in school is a very good thing. More years in school is a very good thing. But you can also question this, because this kind of a quantity, the length of time, really overlooks the issue of quality. So you can have two students from an engineering college. Both have spent 4 years in engineering college. The length of education, duration of education is the same, but their outputs, their quality of learning, teaching, everything is so different. So I think we should not really make this case that, yes, putting more kids into school by giving them vouchers and incentivizing the private schools to retain kids is really working in the benefit of these students. And then also, of course, there's a whole question of productivity that comes in. In fact, many people will argue it's not the number of years you spent in school, but the quality of education and what you have learned, etc., etc. And so the contribution the length cannot be separated from the quality. And in fact, as a matter of fact, when children get promoted in school, it's also because they got some better education in grade 5, so they went to grade 6, they got better education in grade 7, so there is an inbuilt element of quality as well. So as long as we can't assure that the private schools are going to give superior quality education, I think we should be a little wary about this. The fourth point I will make is, yes, the vouchers will have a positive effect on attendance and on educational attainment. I'm not so sure about learning. Yes, in terms of promotion from one grade to the next, it will happen. I cannot see a private school or any school, a private school that is incentivized ever failing a student, because it's not about the student leaving, it's about now my retaining the student in the class. So the incentive is to really keep the kid in my school. And as you rightly say, so I'm not even going to worry about the learning achievement of these kids, because I will ensure that year by year they get promoted and they stay there, and until some grand board exam of sorts where no cheating is allowed, and policemen and the military is monitoring the exams, uh, tests them and tells you what happens. And then I think the motivation of a lot of these private schools, I'm not generalizing now, but a lot of the private, if you look at the higher education, private medical colleges, private education, engineering colleges, is crass money making. And they're really not in the business of imparting education and quality education of the kind that Geeta, you and I really would like our children to have. So I find that a little difficult. But having said that, I'm willing to concede that I think at some level I would not even worry about it so much, because I mean, people say that even till 7 or 8, kids can learn in their own environments. But maybe there is some merit in looking at cash vouchers at the higher levels of school education, maybe at the secondary level, in facilitating the transition from primary to secondary, because there is a serious crisis when it comes to the senior levels. And I don't know much about the private sector in secondary schooling and private sector, but when it comes to science education, laboratories and chemistry and physics, how well our government schools are really equipped to give choices to children. That is what for me really is the crux of the matter, given how little there is emphasis on science as a subject. And it's all now, unfortunately, it's all about learning English, but not going beyond that. The fifth point, then of course there are some very practical considerations that will come up, and I'm sure these are not, they can't be, I mean, these are not, they can't be not resolved in that sense. One is, of course, the eligibility criterion. If you really say that this is going to be universal and not really targeted to poor families, that is a huge expenditure. Now, one way of saying it is that, of course, we're going to close down the government schools, and so whatever money per pupil the government is spending will be given directly. So, in that sense, it weeds out the entire government bureaucracy and the education bureaucracy, etc. We don't even need a department of in the eventual visualization of this private sector leading the education of children in India. You don't even need this thing. You just need a bank officer and a bank account number. I suppose an Aadhaar number will do the trick as well. But practical questions will be, what is the right amount? How do you decide on the right amount? Will it vary from rural to urban? Will it within a school, within the same city, will there be different rates for different schools in different zones? Are you going to make it uniform? And are we going to index it to inflation? And how is it that we are really going to ensure in a practical sense that this money works? And all the time I will juxtapose this against the huge opportunity cost of shying away from radical education reforms of the government sector. And the last point I'd like to make, and the last point I would like to make, is to really ask, what is the vision we have for this country of school education? Now, if the vision for school education is that because of the exodus, emptying, and abandonment of government schools, this country will be the first country, probably the first country in the world where the primary education and school education is delivered by the private sector. That is one vision of where things go, but that is really a problematic position for me to accept. Yes, you talk about accountability. I don't know about accountability in private schools at all. In fact, you and I cannot even enter a private school to check what is happening over there. At least in a government school, as taxpayers, we have some, they allow you to go and conduct a survey and interview children and parents and teachers. If you're talking about empowering parents with choice, I think that's a real myth. If you think if you with a school voucher you have the power to go to a school and pull out your kid and threaten the teacher, you're completely mistaken. Even in the richest of private schools in Delhi, parents in parent teacher association meetings are powerless. They may be well connected, they may be wealthy, they are powerless when it comes to taking on the teachers, because that is not how it's a very what should I say, unrealistic view of how teachers are and who teachers are, and what the teacher parent relationship and the teacher student relationship in schools is. It is extremely unnerving to even tell a teacher that, listen, hey, my child is not learning enough because you're not teaching properly. And the number of questions you get asked as a result, I mean, are you both working, a husband, father and mother working, who's working with the child, how many hours of television, which holidays are you taking? I mean, all kinds of ridiculous questions are asked. So don't even think that this famous choice with a voucher that I can pull my kid out of one school because the teacher said, your kid is not good and go to another school. It's a complete myth. It's a myth for me. From a very upper middle class family, I could never have moved my child out of one school to another school. It was not about vouchers. It was about affordability. We could afford it, but you could never get an admission. So we are in a really, really difficult situation. And then I think to have a vision that there will be no government schools at all, and that the entire public, why do governments subsidize education? Because they see it as a merit good. There are such positive external benefits of education that it is the responsibility of the state. Now, I really find it difficult to buy this argument that over the next, I don't know, let's say 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, every village in India is going to have a top class private schools or a competition among private schools. We are not even able to do that in health, where everybody from 0 to 90 needs medical attention. There is no competition in the private sector. That they don't go to these remote areas. The kind of money you have to give them, it's just, I'm really concerned that if this is the direction, we are really missing out a big point. That yes, we should not, and I'll end up by saying that we cannot visualize, or I cannot visualize, a country like India running on the steam and strength of a private sector in education. We know what happens in the private school universities. Competition does not result in better outcomes. You see in the United States, what is the state of most private universities? Terrible, terrible. I mean, you can't cite a Harvard and a Yale and a Princeton and say, look at the quality of private universities in America. No, look at the state of private universities in India. And so I think we are, as a society, at least we are very far away from really, we need to keep equity issues in the back of our mind. We need to worry about the con games that people play, both in government schools and in private schools. But as a taxpayer, I feel much more confident that we have to push the state to usher in dramatic reforms that I entirely agree with you in terms of accountability, in terms of the teaching that goes on inside the school, about monitoring learning outcomes, and so on and so forth. And I would really think that the idea is a nice idea, but it might not work in the context in which we operate and live in India.
One of the things I understood you said is that the narrative for why why people, well, you basically said that if you have conditional cash transfers, that is going to increase schooling participation, is going to retain children within the school, and that in itself is not enough. And I totally agree with you on that retaining children in school, having them, bums on seats, is not the thing. It's not the number of years of sitting in school that matters, but the quality that matters, what you've learned, the outcomes that you have, the skills that you have. That is the thing that matters for subsequent labor market outcomes and other goodies. However, the narrative from what we hope for from a school voucher is it's not a conditional cash transfer to induce people to stay in school. That would indeed, in fact, I feel that would be unethical. Not just that it would be, as I agree with you, that it's not something that is desirable at all, just to keep them in school and not learning. But the narrative that I was presenting was that a school voucher is not something that is just going to retain children in poor quality school, but that through fostering competition, inter-school competition, is going to actually improve the outcomes of the schools. It's going to improve the outcomes for the children. So that was the narrative. Now, you've questioned that later on as well. We can have a discussion about that as to whether competition improves outcomes. But my narrative was not about conditional cash transfers in order to retain children in school, but school vouchers in order to improve the quality of schooling. Secondly, you talked about the logistics. Would it be a universal voucher? That'll be huge expenditure. How are we going to target it? In fact, there's a suggestion by an American economic theorist who suggests that the voucher amount could in principle be made inverse to family income. So in fact, it can be targeted in principle. Of course, we know that there are some difficulties, feasibility problems, but of course, with the coming of Aadhaar, it may become a lot easier to target a benefit like a voucher to the intended recipients, and even to make the voucher amount, proportion inverse to family income. You're suggesting that we don't shy away from radical reform of the government sector because you're concerned about the lack of accountability. You're questioning whether the private school can necessarily be held accountable. And the example that you gave, I totally agree with that. Namely, for example, in a city like Delhi, it's actually not a possibility for a parent to pull out their child from one school and hope that they can admit them in another, because there's such a situation of constrained supply. And that is why there's a paucity of schools. The number of school places that are available is so small in relation to the demand for them, in relation to the size of the population, that it is actually, ultimately, it is no choice. So that the voucher idea has to be accompanied with the idea that there have to be few supply constraints. It has to be very properly managed, so that you allow the private sector to grow in response to the demand, rather than policy-wise constraining the supply of places. There are a few other things that I could say, but I think that we should let the questions happen now, please.
So I guess there were many interesting insights, but at this moment we're also getting lots of questions from the audience. So yeah, so I'll just highlight the first question coming on your way. Yeah. So we have the first question.
Yeah, I mean,
on
I guess
screen.
that I
Yeah.
didn't see.
Yeah, which you just talked about. But Professor Kumar, if you would like to put some reflection on this question.
Now, the question is, it's absolutely true that, because the scarcity of, it's not even good schools, I would argue, because if you I'm talking about Delhi, there are a number of good schools, but you don't want to actually antagonize the school teacher or the class teacher. And I think that is where the issue comes. I know lots of principals who are fantastic leaders of private school teachers, private schools, and they have a very broad vision. I mean, there are a number of excellent private schools in Delhi, but it is the individual teacher who counts. And how do parents get empowered to have conversations with the teachers? Because the school management, at least in the government schools, you have some kind of a government resources, so you have a lot of people overseeing it. But in a private school, it's a closed door. Nobody can even get there. So I don't know how this will really. I agree with Geeta to the extent that if there's a huge boom in private schools, and there is really there's no shortage in scarcity, and we do have as parents the option of going from one school to the other. Yes. But it's also a very traumatic experience for a child to be moved from a school every 2 years or every 3 years for whatever reason. So I am not so sure if parents can become more confident, more empowered to take on teachers, because teachers themselves are going to get even more empowered and more confident as the time goes. So I'm a bit pessimistic on this one, that the gap between the capacity of parents to negotiate is always going to be much below the capacity of teachers to hold their ground. I have sort of answered my views on this question. I think it's more for Geeta to say from her experience, when people are paying such high fees, why are they still in the stuck? They're stuck. One answer, of course, is the shortage of options that we have. But Geeta might have a different view.
No, I mean, I agree with you, AK, and that's exactly what I also said earlier on, that there is a supply constraint, and that is really the reason. Of course, I accept the point that AK has made regarding the fact that, um, when children are in a school, they make friends, they don't want to move out easily, or unless there's real strong reason. However, focus for a moment on the competition aspect of it and the likely effect of competition. People are when schools know that there are several schools in the locality, if it's a situation of something close to perfectly competitive market in school education, necessarily it'll be the case that schools will have to be on their toes. Why is it that schools function apparently better? Private schools are functioning reasonably better than government schools. In a state like Uttar Pradesh, I'll give you the example: 12% of grade 5 children in government schools can do a grade 2 level maths question, a simple division question. 12%. In private schools, it's close to 40%, 39 point something percent. 12% versus 40%. 3.5, nearly 4 times as many children in private schools are able to do it. And I do think that part of the reason must be that they are able to, they have to compete with each other in order to retain children. For their survival, they have to work. Their teachers are working under the disadvantage of being less educated, less trained, and working with per student expenditure that is a small fraction of that in the government schooling sector. And yet they are giving, in Uttar Pradesh, learning outcomes that are nearly 4 times as much as in the government schooling sector. As I said before, part of that is because they are from better home backgrounds, but certainly a part of it is because the private schools are definitely giving better outcomes. And why would that be surprising at all if they were giving a better outcome, if they were higher quality? Because we know that the attendance rates of teachers is significantly better in the private schools than in the public, which shows that accountability is greater. If it is greater, where is it that greater accountability coming from? I believe it is coming from competition. And that is the narrative why I think where there is a non-constrained supply of private schools to fill the market to the extent of the demand that exists for such a facility, then you shall find that there is perfect competition situation. They cannot raise their price above the normal profit level, and that will also mean that parents get a better service. And it's better for the taxpayer as well, because at the moment we have this is another perspective that we don't ever look at, as if public money is of no consequence. Public money is taxpayers' money. If you look at per pupil expenditure, the government school sector. Now, I'm not making the case for private schools here at all, because this is not a forum in which I'm trying to say that private schools are better than government schools and therefore let's have more of private schools, and a way of getting private schools is by having more vouchers. No. The idea is that vouchers would exist as a way of funding government funded schools. Private schools would also exist, and if the government wishes to give elementary education free of cost entirely for all the children in the country, which would be the civilized thing to do, then the government can make school voucher applicable for private schools, tenable at private schools as well. So then it's no longer a question of arguing for private schools and against government schools, or for government schools against private schools. It's not that. It's not an ideological battle. It's a battle of what works, and it's a question of equity. If the government takes the position, which I believe any sane and good government should, that is going to keep elementary education totally government funded, then it would make the school voucher applicable at whichever kind of school it is allowing. If it allows both private schools and public schools, the voucher would be available. And the competition would be not only between government schools and private schools, it will be, as I said before, among all the government schools themselves and among all the private schools and across the two sectors. And I think the narrative is as to why I think DBT would be better for improving the quality of education in the country, unless, apart from hoping that after 70 years of trying out all our best ideas, we're not still able to radically reform the government schooling sector, as AK and I and all of us would hope. Then I think that it is time that we do give DBT a try. And it's the competition narrative rather than any other narrative, I think.
Thanks, Geeta. So we have 2 minutes before we end the session. So the last question, I guess, that we should be taking.
Just one quick point I want to make is that just like in health, we've stopped using the word private sector in health, because the sector is so heterogeneous, from quacks on one hand, there is quackery, and then you have these 5-star hospitals on the other hand, offering fantastic super specialty care. So I think similarly, it is very difficult to lump all private schools together. And I think that mistake we should not do, because there are shades and shades and shades of private schools. And once you talk about private schools as an option for parents, then we have to figure out what kind of private schools we're talking about. Will there be some regulation in terms of the standards of education? Will there be regulation of fees? How much is the voucher worth? Will that entitle the parent or empower the parent to go for which level of private schooling is also very important. So I think a lot of these things have to be sorted out, because in principle it might work. I have no, like you said, it's not an ideological question, but it doesn't. We should not leave the government off the hook. That's what I'm saying in terms of reforming their own schools. In terms of coming back to this very quickly, the universal basic income, I think it is gaining currency. It is gaining currency because it gives money in the hands of people, and they have the choice to do what they want with it. My only concern with that has always been, what do they end up doing? And most often in the small studies that I have been associated with, when families get this money, they spend it on health and education. In education, it's mostly either you go to a private, shift a kid from a government school to a private school, or get a private tutor or tuition fixed for him, or you go to a private healthcare. And again, what worries me is that it is not a solution to the fundamental long-term problem that universal basic income is trying to solve, of alleviating poverty and improving the standards of living of people. It's again a band-aid situation, because if the healthcare system is so bad in a village, and if the school system is terrible in a village, just going from the government to the private is really not solving the fundamental issue of long-term benefits and tangible benefits, intergenerational benefits for poor families.
Thank you, Professor Shiva, and yeah, I would like to thank you once again, especially the thank to two of our distinguished speakers for coming and spending time with us online and answering questions.